Up until this point, we've only written applications with a single template and a single controller. This is great for gaining a conceptual understanding, but in practice, our applications are likely to have many templates and many controllers. Which template a user sees and which controller is applied to that template should be dictated by the URL that a user visits. URLs are sometimes referred to as routes, and to facilitate the binding between a route and our templates and controllers, we're going to use a third-party library called UI-Router. This library is very popular among Angular users, and it has great documentation which can be found at this page. To add this library to our application, we're going to go find its CDN, which can be found at cdnjs.com, and we're going to get version 0.4.2 of Angular UI Router. Then, in our index.html, we're going to place a script underneath our Angular script. With this library added as a script to our index.html, we're now ready to start using it in our Angular application. Let's go to our app.js file, and the first thing that we're going to do is add it as a dependency to our application. And that's done by adding it as a string UI.router to the array of dependencies in our module. The next thing we're going to do is add a config function. We do this by adding angular.config to our application and then passing in the function definition of our configuration. This is different from our factoring controller because we don't have the option of actually naming our config. And then we're going to add the dependency injections to that config function. In this case, we're only going to add the $state provider. This is an object provided by UI Router to facilitate creating states in our application. And then we're going to define our config function. We're going to pass in that $state provider as a parameter, and with that $state provider, we're going to begin to define states for our application. And the state method accepts two parameters. The first is the name of the state itself, and the second is an object containing different configurations for that state. One configuration that we need to provide is the URL for that state. In this case, we're just going to provide a simple URL of /temp. We also need to tell it where to find the template URL of that state, and that's going to be a relative path to the HTML file that contains our template. In this case, I've just added a temp.html file to our application. Finally, we're going to tell it which controller to use and bind to that template. In this case, I'm going to use the controller we created in the previous sections called myController, which is defined below. Now that we have a state defined, let's actually put it to use. And we're going to do that by going back into our index.html file and adding a div element that contains a UI-view directive. This UI-view directive is part of that UI Router library that we included in our application, and it simply tells Angular to replace this div element with whatever template we specified according to the URL that our user is currently visiting. So when our user visits that temp URL, it's going to populate this div element with our temp.html template. And this temp.html template simply iterates through our widgets and creates a table of our widget name and widget price. Let's go to our browser to see this in action. And when we go to that URL, localhost 3000 / temp, it appears like nothing is happening. And what's strange is that there are no errors in our console when we inspect the page. So what's going on here? Well, let's go back to our index.html and add one more thing that might tip us off as to what's going on with our routes. And that thing I'm going to add is an anchor tag with another directive from the UI Router library called UI-sref. And that sref stands for state reference. So that directive is going to take us to the proper URL of that state we specified when we click on that anchor tag. Let's go back to our browser and see what URL it takes us to. And when we go back to our browser and click on that anchor tag we just created, it takes us to /hashbang /temp. And this hashbang is just Angular convention that always precedes whatever URLs we specify. We can get rid of them using something called HTML5 mode, but we're not going to cover that in this course. For now, just be conscientious that if you go directly to a URL that you specified in your states, you need to preface it with a hashbang.